Well, good afternoon, everyone. Glad that you could join us today. We're really excited to have an important conversation, and we're talking about, are you insured for miracle treatments? And what we're going to talk about today is gene and cellular therapy, which truly are miracles. At a minimum, they could be life-changing for the patients that receive them, but at the best case, they could be life-saving. So we want to make sure that patients have access to them. But if you're a self-funded plan sponsor, you need to know the dark side of these treatments, and that's the price tag associated with them. So this is going to be a really important conversation, probably a 500 level course, and that's why I'm really excited to be hosting this with Ben Connor. I'm Mike Hill, the founder of Total Control Health Plans, and whenever I run into something complex, the first person I call is my good friend Ben Connor, who's the CEO of Connor Insurance. He was recently selected as the most innovative healthcare consultant in the country at an industry conference we were all at in Miami earlier this year. Ben, thanks for joining me today.
Mike, thanks for having me, and pleased to be a host with you today. Mike, this is a topic that you and I have definitely talked about for years, and it seems that we're coming to kind of a crossroads of how to manage this within an employer health plan. So thank you for putting this together, and thank you for getting the group that you have to speak to us today to look at all sides of this. And I think there's one thing about how do we execute something within a health plan around gene and cellular therapies, but I think the question before we get to execution is, what's the strategy? As you mentioned, this is like a 500 level course, maybe even a doctorate program when it comes to employee benefits. So for those that are attending today, buckle up, and we're recording this. So if you need to come back to some of the details, we can certainly do that. But we'll be happy to walk you through this. I think it can be, as a leader of an employer benefit program, it's sometimes it's hard to know where you should spend your time. But Mike, as I talked to you earlier, they always say, why did Dillinger rob the banks? And it's because that's where the money is. And I think to the same thing, when you look at your benefit strategy, you need to go where there's the most impact. And this is right in the bullseye of that. So again, Mike, thanks for having us, and I'm looking forward to getting this thing going.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ben. Well, what I'm going to do today is just give a little overview of our panelists, and actually I'll just do a real quick review of this, and then we'll talk about what they're going to be touching on. Ben and I are knowledgeable on these topics, but not nearly knowledgeable enough, which is why we need to surround ourselves with experts. And we have a wonderful panel of experts with us today. We have Eric Barker, the Chief Growth Officer with TrueRx Health Strategies, Josh McGee, Vice President of Program Development for Stealth Partner Group, attorney Jennifer McCormick with the FIA Group, and Ann Jackson, a principal and consulting actuary with Milliman. So these are the folks that are really going to give us the nuggets that we want to take away today. And we're going to approach it in this format. First, we're going to define what is gene and cellular therapy, just so we can use the terms to mean the same thing to everybody here. Secondly, we want to quantify how big this risk is to insurance plans and self-funded plans specifically. Then we're going to dive into the role that the PBM can play on this particular topic with Eric Barker. We're going to talk about what the stop-loss market is doing to respond to this potential catastrophic situation for some self-funded health plans with Josh McGee. Jennifer McCormick is going to help us touch on what we can and can't do from a do we cover it or don't we cover it standpoint. And then Ann's going to talk about the work that Milliman's been doing, not only to help health plans prepare for this and figure out how they price accordingly, but also with the life sciences industry. It's one thing to develop a drug, but if no one's going to pay you for it, it really hasn't helped you at all. And so Ann's going to talk about how the pharmaceutical and the biosciences industry is working to take creative approaches to financing these drugs. Finally, we're going to open it up for Q&A, and we certainly invite you to submit questions throughout, and we'll get to them as we can. But our goal is about 1 o'clock to open it up for Q&A. I know we'll have a lot of questions, and if we wrap up early, we will certainly do that, but we will definitely close the show by 1:30 today. All right, so let's dive into this. Let's define cellular and gene therapies. So we all are using it to mean the same thing. So gene therapy Pretty straightforward here is a technique that modifies a person's genes. Sounds easy, but it is really, really complicated. And the goal is trying to treat or ultimately cure a disease that's cured by a particular or caused by a particular genetic condition. There's multiple different ways that this can be done. So saying gene therapy is a very broad term, but it can take many different shapes and forms. We can actually pull a gene out and replace it with a correct one or a non-flawed one. We can just turn off the flawed gene in some situations, or we might need to introduce a new one if there's a missing gene or modify one in one way, shape, or form. So that's the generic term or theory of gene therapy. And then there's a subset of that that's cellular gene therapy, where actual human cells are being potentially taken out of the human body, genetically modified, and then reintroduced into the body to cure a particular disease or fix a particular condition. So when we say cellular therapy, yes, that is part of the gene therapy category, but not all gene therapies are cellular therapy. So then let's talk about how long this has been something that's been facing health plans. What's the history or the timeline of these types of treatments? Going way back in time to 1953, that's when the DNA structure was first discovered, and that's then the basis that everything we're going to talk about today is built on. The first really first big treatment to hit the market leveraging the knowledge of the DNA structure was Humulin, which is a insulin used to treat diabetes. Moving forward, about 8 years fast forward to 1990, there were a number of patients being treated with different gene therapies. But by 1999, a number of patients had died from a variety of these treatments. They'd either developed cancer or died for a variety of reasons. And so the industry as a whole tapped the brakes and said, the way we've been introducing these therapies into the body has not been working. The adverse effects are outweighing the actual goal we're trying to achieve. And so tapped the brakes. Then about 2012 is when really started to see what we're talking about here today start really moving at a higher rate of speed. The first commercially viable gene therapy was Glybera, but ultimately it was pulled off the market for a number of different reasons. Number one was the cost, and that's why we're here today, is to talk about the cost, but also at the time, the ability to manufacture this drug and all of the hoops that the manufacturer had to jump through to get approval, not only in Europe, but in the United States and other countries around the world. They ultimately pulled the plug on this medication. And when they pulled the plug in 2017, 5 years later, at that time, only 31 patients had received it. That's another really important thing we're going to talk about when we talk about the scale of this issue. These treatments are intended to target a very, very small, rare condition set. So the number of patients with these conditions is pretty low, but the rate at which these are coming out and the number of conditions that these are being developed to treat is growing exponentially. And so it's only a matter of time that we believe that your health plan is going to see gene therapy hit it in one way, shape, or form. Fast forward to the present. 2017, the FDA approved 2 new CAR-T. These are cellular therapies used to treat types of cancer. 2017, the first pharmaceutical side of things, Luxturna, to treat a rare form of blindness, and you'll hear more about Luxturna as we move through this, came on the market in 2017. And by 2019, then Zolgensma had hit the market. So one drug here, one drug there. Well, let's talk about the rate at which these things are now starting to be developed. This is taking a look at the projected financial impact or market of these types of therapies over the next couple of years. So here we are in 2023, projecting it to be about a $6.7 billion industry. Not that big right now, but just in 3 years' time, it's expected to be knocking on the door of 30 billion. And if we were to extrapolate this out into the next 5 years beyond that, it's going to be even bigger. So let's talk about what's on the horizon from a gene therapy standpoint. So 2022 was a record year, and you're going to hear this theme over and over again. It's going to sound like a broken record in the fact that 2022 was a record year because 3 new therapies were approved, and one to treat rare diseases and 1 for cancer. And then 5 had been expanded to other geographies around the world, and they'd received their national approval at that point. But now, as of today in 2023, we're projecting that 13 brand new cell therapies or gene therapies may hit the market in this year alone. And back in 2019, the FDA was saying that they anticipated that by the year 2025, they'd be approving somewhere between 10 and 20 new therapies each and every year. So this is still very, very new. Likely you have not seen claims hitting your plan for it yet, but it's only a matter of time that you will. It's kind of like hockey players. There's two types of hockey players, those that have lost some teeth and those that are going to lose some teeth. Similar to health plans, there's those that have paid claims already, pretty small percentage of them, but we think in the next 4 to 5 years, most health plans will start to see claims like this, either for cancers or other gene therapies. So I also want to just kind of drive this point home that the reason we're having this conversation right now is that insurance plans, either commercial insurance plans, your Blue Cross Blue Shields of the world, or self-funded plans are simply not prepared for what this new reality could mean from a financial standpoint. So we need to reassess how we're building our health plans. There's nothing like this that has hit health insurance plans in quite some time. So we really need to start thinking about how are we managing these risks and likely using tools that we haven't used before. This is true of the government plans as well as our own private health insurance plans. To make this point, I mentioned Zolgensma as a drug that hit the market not that long ago. If we were to just use that one particular medication and extrapolate it out in terms of, okay, what are these other medications going to mean to the market? It could potentially add $10 billion a year to the nation's healthcare bill. What that means is that's $50 for every covered American per year in additional cost simply because of some of these treatments. And that doesn't take into account the cost of administrating these medications. So these things are complicated. It's not just a pill that you take and you're good to go, but it's very, very complicated in terms of how the treatments are developed and then how they're administered to the patient, in some cases taking maybe a month hospitalization to accomplish this. So this truly is a kind of Wild West and could be catastrophic to certain healthcare plans, which is why we're here today. Just a couple of other background items before we turn it over to Mr. Barker to talk about what PBMs can help us do. This is looking at 2023. We're already a third of the way through 2023, but in the dark purple, these are gene therapies, either cellular or gene therapies that could be approved by the FDA this year. And the pink are those that might be approved in Europe. And what we commonly see is if it's approved in Europe, it oftentimes crosses the Atlantic and vice versa. So if these make approval in Europe, it likely won't be long before they're approved in the United States as well. So this is becoming very, very real. A couple other things, just talking about the pipeline of these types of therapies that may be hitting the market. So this is from the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy, and this is from their January reporting on Q4 of 2022. As of the writing of this quarterly report, there are almost 3,800 therapies in development. And of those, 55% were gene therapies and 22% were representing cell therapies. So these are things like, again, the CAR T, which I want to touch on here in just a moment. So CAR T, you may have heard of it, but this is a new, potentially life-saving, life-changing treatment for cancers. And ultimately what they're doing is they're removing an individual's own T cells that are part of the immune system from their body, genetically modifying them, injecting them with a virus actually that targets whatever the cancer cells they are intending to target, and then re-injecting millions of these cells into the body in an effort to target just the cancer cells and eliminate it. And this is not your first step of therapy. If you have a particular cancer where these have been developed to treat, this is a last resort, but the results are pretty mind-blowing. For one kind of lymphoma, for example, based upon some recent studies, for patients that failed all other treatments, when they used CAR T, 9 out of 10 either went into remission or were fully cured. So these are pretty incredible treatments if they work for the particular situation that someone may have. What we see commercial insurance companies doing with these types of things is as these are starting to hit the market, they are starting to cover them, but only as a last resort. And so as we talk about plan documents and things that you can and can't do from a plan design standpoint with Jennifer later on, this will be one thing we want to think about is making sure our plan documents speak to how we intend to cover these if we intend to cover them. So of the cellular therapy, real quickly, the vast majority are targeting oncology. And as we know, cancers are quite common at this day and age, unfortunately. And so that's why we think it's a matter of if not when your plan will see either a cellular therapy claim or a gene therapy claim. Real quickly, just to hit on a couple other key points before we turn it over to Ben and Eric. When we're looking at the types of conditions that these therapies are being developed to treat, number one is cancer, and then number two is the rare diseases. when we're talking about how active the clinical trial process is, just in Q4 of 2022, 41 new clinical trials on various treatments were started. About 75% were oncology and 25% were non-oncology, but this is coming fast. And again, if you're somebody that needs one of these treatments, it's amazing and it can't come fast enough. But if we're not ahead of the curve on making sure we're managing our plan well, these could have very catastrophic effects on our plan. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben to introduce Eric Barker and kick off the conversation on the PBM side of things.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And the intention, just for everyone on this webinar, is not to scare you. We actually, we want to illuminate a possibility, a strategic possibility for the future that no one's really talking about at a great scale just yet. But our next four panelists are going to show you how, when we look at this from all sides, we can begin building a strategy that can put your business in a great spot. So congrats to everyone to be on this call. I want to introduce my friend, Eric Barker, Chief Growth Officer with TrueRx Health Strategist. And he's also a pharmacist. So the cool thing is I know at any time I interact with Eric, he has a wonderful perspective of the business side, as well as the medicine, as the pharmacy side. So we're going to be looking for him to answer some critical questions for us of what role will the PBM have on gene therapy costs? What about cellular therapies that are covered by the medical side of the plan? And is the gene therapy industry having an impact on the insurance pricing yet? So without further ado, Eric, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you both, both Ben and Mike, for having me today. This is obviously a really big deal. I remember when I was fresh out of pharmacy school and Lipitor hit $1 billion in annual sales, and we all just kind of looked at each other and said, wow, I don't know that we'll ever see that again. Humira peaked at $23 billion. We believe we have the first $50 billion medication on the market, and now we're not even scared by those things anymore. So, and it's interesting, Mike, I really appreciated the history you gave there, because, in 1949, Linus Pauling described sickle cell anemia as a molecular disease. And he was the first one to really coin that phrase and develop that thinking. So here, 75 years later, we're just now figuring out what to do about what are ultimately molecular diseases and genetic diseases. So, first question here, what role will a PBM have on gene therapy cost? The reality is most of these costs are going to run through the medical side. You mentioned in some cases people being in a hospital for up to 30 days. The complexity of administering these medications are all going to be billed under the TPA side of things. I think the role of the PBM will be very much one of an advisory role, working with advisors like yourself and Ben, working with clients, with TPA partners to sort of suggest, which gene therapies, if any, should be covered, which disease states are more prevalent. Obviously, there are much more people with sickle cell anemia than they are spinal muscular atrophy, which Zolgensma treats. In the case of Zolgensma, in theory, there are only 600 people a year born with SMA who need that. Now, the other side of that coin is the manufacturer of Zolgensma, Novartis, has started to study it for multiple dosing. So not just once in a lifetime. They're studying it now in people with minor forms of spinal muscular atrophy who might be in their 30s, in their 20s, and again, using multiple dosings. I'm sure Novartis, out of the kindness of their heart, will take the cost down from $2.3 million a dose to $50 a dose when they start doing it multiple times like that. But I think the PBM's real role there is going to be bringing in their clinical experts to help you understand just the nature of the challenge, the nature of the diseases. One of the biggest questions I get to ask, Ben and I have a great story about Zolgensma that we were able to source at no cost once many years ago when it first came out. And I was sitting in an airport and this gentleman overheard me talking to people on my team trying to come up with a solution. And he said, is there really a medication that costs $2.3 million? And I said, yeah. And he asked a question, which funny to me as a pharmacist, but he said, how many times a day do you have to take that? And I kind of laughed, but it was a fair question from a layman's term. And he said, that's once in your life. And that's, I think, the role the PBMs are really going to have to play, is being a clinical advisor, using their nursing staff, their pharmacist staff to advise people like yourself and employers, and again, TPA partners. Is there a return on investment for these medications? Well, the CAR T therapy with some of the cancer drugs has been amazing. I think will eventually lead to the point that those will be the first line agents, not the last line, because there's been so many life savings. Zolgensma, for instance, the FDA studies, which we read obsessively at Trurex, all of our pharmacists were reading every one that would come out. One of the study endpoints stated that the child will stand unassisted for 3 seconds. If you're a parent who has a child with SMA, that's a really important 3 seconds. If you're an employer, that's a really expensive 3 seconds. And so what's that balance? What's the risk? And I think that's the primary role a PBM will have in this, is to make sure to just offer you a lot of really, really good advice. And
Yeah,
one
question for you.
Yeah.
You mentioned you've had experience getting Zolgensma for free using one of the many strategies that employers may be using today to get specialty medications at lower cost.
Right.
I think that's going to be a viable strategy for these medications moving forward, or is that kind of a lucky situation?
I think the alternative funding solutions we've created for specialty medications and some high cost maintenance medications may be worthwhile. It's certainly not going to hurt to try those. That's actually what we did with Zolgensma. We used an alternative funding source, and there were some nuances about the individual patient that Ben and I had to figure out, but it ended up working out. There's almost a gentleman's agreement between the FDA and the pharmaceutical manufacturers that if a patient is uninsured, underinsured, and can't afford these, it really shouldn't be held back. Novartis, for instance, has a program that if you're uninsured, they will provide Zolgensma to you, because it's such a bluntly a bad look for them to deny newborn babies with a horrible genetic disorder. But definitely there will be something along those ways. We're seeing, and I don't want to steal thunder from some of the other people on here, but we're seeing long-term payment. We're seeing value-added approaches where if the medication doesn't produce certain results, the cost of it goes down over time. And so I think we still also haven't seen the solution that's really going to work. There's a lot of ideas, up to and including the government just paying for it, but there's no magic answer yet. But bluntly, you have to be, as you said, we have to be preparing for this today. We can't wait too long for it to happen. But we have had some success getting some gene therapies through alternative funding programs that we currently use for specialty drugs. And like every situation, each patient is different, each medication is different, and it's different every single time.
Eric, I have a question for you.
Sure, Ben.
I thought you brought up an interesting point about looking at results and those sorts of things. And I think putting myself in an employer's perspective, that's a really tough spot to be put in.
It is.
The money and the results. With that being said, what have you seen? Again, we talked about Zolgensma 4 or 5 years ago together. What have you seen in maybe the change or clarity around results, or even what are some things that you would encourage employers to ask as far as questions around results?
I think that the main question around results, because again, these are difficult human decisions, right? Again, my 3 seconds around Zolgensma, how important is that to that family? It may be one of their greatest memories. But results are going to be the key. And that's where a lot of the manufacturers are going with value-based payment systems. If our medication doesn't deliver what we promised you, you won't have to pay as much, or you won't have to pay for that. It's a great idea. The problem becomes, what is a definition of success? Let's stay with spinal muscular atrophy and Zolgensma. The reality is, with no treatment, if you were born 15 years ago, you had a life expectancy of a few years, 5 at most, and frankly, your life wasn't going to be very pleasant in those times. Now we're seeing cases where children are able to sit up, they're living longer. Obviously, the medication's only been around a few years, so we don't know if they'll live to 10 or 15 or 20. They're more interactive. Some children are speaking, which are amazing things. But going back to your role of an employer, Ben, how do you balance that? I mean, that you want to care for your employees, you want to do the right thing, but sometimes you have to do it at the expense of everyone else. And I think that's always the difficulty, whether it's a specialty medication, whether it's, the looming question over all of our heads about covering weight loss drugs that's coming down the pipeline in the next 6 months. What's the human side of this? And so I think, again, going back to where I started with the role of a PBM, I have to give you good clinical advice. For Zolgensma, this patient, we can make their life amazingly better than it was, right? We can make miracles for families. We're not going to cure this. And contrary to what Zolgensma said, I've not seen them cure SMA once yet, but we will look for outcomes that are positive, and we have to define those ahead of time going in. And that is not an easy situation. You really need a lot of expertise. I know there's a gene therapy conference in Minnesota. I think it's either this month or next month. And at Truex, we've got a couple of our pharmacists attending because it's so important for us to learn and to be able to speak intelligently on each one of those disease states and what the positive outcomes are. Sickle cell anemia, for instance, there was a football player who couldn't go to NFL player who couldn't play in Denver because it was too dangerous for him. So he had to not travel with his team every time they played. His successful outcome may be, I go to Denver and I play football because that's my job. Someone else's may be, I'm not in pain. I can hold a job down. I'm going to live past the age of 45. And that's where expertise is really needed. And bluntly, whether it's a pharmacist, a nurse, a physician, other providers, you're going to need someone with that expertise to give you the right answer.
So Eric, if I just had to summarize your thoughts, and we're going to circle back with you for Q&A here as well, but very much with self-funded plans, historically, it's nice to be able to build a plan, kind of set it and forget it, and not have to get into the weeds or do these one-off type things. And what I hear you saying is that it's entirely possible within the legal parameters that a plan can operate in. It may be a situation by situation determination that's made, and not necessarily the employers making it, but the team that has come around them to help manage the plan. There's going to have to be more dialogue had. Is that correct?
There absolutely is. There is no way, Mike, to predict which rare disease you're going to run into. There are just too many of them. And some of them, there's ones all the time that I see I've never heard of. I have to go look it up and I feel kind of silly. I'm like, I should know this. And then I'm like, oh, there are 100 people in the world with this. I shouldn't know that. You have no control over who walks in your door as an employee and what they're carrying and what they may have or what their children born in 3 years may have. So you're right. It is going to be an individualized decision, I think, patient by patient.
Perfect. Thank you. So shifting gears here slightly then. So Ben and I had the conversation a couple of years ago. We're like, so what? There's not that big of a deal. We've got stop loss insurance, and that's going to cover this for us, but it's definitely not as simple as that. And there's going to be some unique responses in the stop loss and reinsurance industries as a result of what's coming down the pike towards us, which is why we're lucky to be joined by Josh McGee, who's the Vice President of Program Development with Stealth Partner Group, an Amwins company. They are our partner for stop loss, and they have developed a program that's starting to chip away at this potential risk. But Josh, we're hoping you can get us up to speed, talk a little bit about some of these questions, and I think I screwed this slide up, and so I have some questions for you. But do you have slides you want to share, Josh?
Oh, we'll just chat through it, and if there's questions that pop up, we can along the way, please jump in. But to your point, one of the most challenging parts of managing a self-funded plan is the year in, year out interaction, and some of that concern about what's going to happen at renewal with the stop loss premium. Are we going to have additional risk exposures through lasers or other types of exclusions in the policy that could create concern, heartburn, financial risk for a self-funded employer or the plan sponsor? And as we've seen more cellular therapy, gene therapy, new technology come to the space, we've seen a continued pressure that's been building over time. What we've observed between The end of 2019 and through the COVID pandemic was a bit of a pause with the FDA, where they stopped really kind of approving these because they were focused on the vaccines for COVID and managing that. But we've seen since then, after that, really a lot of activity from the FDA. We saw a lot of pent-up demand from patients across the country that have come through. What we've observed since then is a threefold increase in claims that are exceeding $2 million per year. And a lot of those are through these gene therapy, cell therapy types of treatments that we're experiencing. So the pressure is there. Loss ratios have gone up from about a 78% loss ratio in 2019 to an 83, 85, 84% loss ratio that we're going to observe for 2022, which leads us all to speculate, and I think rightly so, that we're going to continue to see a hardening of the stop loss market, and essentially a bit of a dumbbell, the haves and have-nots. The groups who are performing well, who don't have risk and a lot of risk and exposure, are getting very favorable outcomes. And then the groups who have moderate to higher risk indications are really getting hit very hard in the marketplace today. But eventually that's going to have to flatten out, and everybody's going to experience some of that price pressure. And the price pressure from a premium perspective is important, but I reiterate to our clients and our team on a daily basis that there are hidden exposures that you really have to pay attention to. And some of that is going to be specific in this space. As we continue to see more treatments come to the market, what we're observing from an actuarial perspective is that by the end of this year, because of the medications that we anticipate being in the marketplace, we're going to see a $10, $11 increase per employee per month in cost across the board. That includes fully insured and self-funded plans. So we hear quite often that people say, well, I'll just go back fully insured if I have these types of risk and if I can manage it that way. And that's certainly a strategy to consider as far as evaluating all your options. But the reality is that all of the marketplace is going to have to absorb this, and this is something you can't escape. So finding a way to manage these actively, being proactive, putting in the appropriate guardrails to protect your plan, whether it's through SPD language changes, through products and offerings that are coming to the market that we'll talk about, or other creative solutions, which were mentioned by Eric in the last conversation, reaching out to manufacturers, having those conversations, trying to find other solutions. So it's really going to be all of the above approach from the marketplace to manage this and absorb it over the next few years, because this is going to pick up pace. Right now, what we can say that the market is doing from a stop loss and a reinsurance perspective is really multifaceted. We have seen one of the early entries was a product called Embark that came into the marketplace in 2019 covering Luxturna, Zolgensma. That was a very early movement. Then we had COVID, things stopped. And then when we saw at the end of last year, additional treatments that were approved into the marketplace, such as Integlo, Skysona, and these products are ranging right now with Hemgenix being approved and Roctavian right here on the horizon in the third quarter, ranging costs from $850,000 to about $3.5 million for these treatments. And again, remarkable technology, remarkable treatment, life-saving, life-changing treatments, but we do have to find a way to manage it. What we observed in 22 from a number of the larger stop-loss carriers was introduction of various types of products. One are offering additional coverage for an additional expense that's tied into their product, almost like a rider to your stop-loss policy, but it tags you with that administrator or that stop-loss carrier policy. And these range anywhere from $2 to $5 per employee per month in cost for different levels of coverage. We've also seen other carriers who have socialized the expense across their book of business and have communicated that they, if and when one of these occur, they will remove that from your experience so that it doesn't impact you negatively from an ongoing price perspective. And we've also seen other offerings that have come to market, whether it's filed, fully insured products that Optum is bringing to bear. They are one of the bigger players in what we all have known for a long time was a fully insured organ transplant policy. There's some similarities between those types of policies and this type of coverage. So they've began the process of filing a product that will cover some of these on a similar basis. We have also seen with products that our organization has brought to bear is a product that is not a filed product. It's running through different type of a risk management structure, but effectively is taking that risk out. And some of the key tenets that I say for all these products that are critical for employers to look at is a couple of things. And one is, what is your risk tolerance? How do you want to cover these? And I know we have the other speakers coming up here shortly. They'll talk about what you can do from your SPD language change and managing this from a risk perspective. And that's certainly an option to consider. And everybody should really look at that and define how this fits into their organization from a risk perspective and a cultural perspective, and balance that out. Like we heard Eric talking about, how do you balance out these types of equations between treating folks and the cost associated with that. Everybody's going to have a different opinion. But one thing I'll say on that front is, from a stop loss perspective, make sure that whatever you have is sent to your stop loss carrier, that it aligns with your underlying stop loss policy and that you do not have any coverage gaps. You want to make sure that you're very transparent on that front with your stop loss carrier, and that they're aware of how you're covering these or not covering these, and make sure that the appropriate premium considerations are applied and that appropriate language is covered in your stop loss contract so that there's no gaps. We saw one last year where there was a gap. The SPD wasn't finalized in time. It was issued late. Stop loss carrier was under one impression. Eventually, those didn't align perfectly, and a $2.2 million SMA claim occurred in that window, and it became a very contentious situation where there was a lot of back and forth, attorneys going back and forth between the employer, the administrator, and the stop loss carriers. So making sure those changes are done timely and communicated timely and transparently is very critical. The second thing I'll say is, outside of SPD language, looking at these other options, make sure that you understand what you're buying, what it covers, how it covers it, and how that policy is backed and insured, and that you're working with very highly rated partners to cover some of those concerns, whether it's a captive type of structure or a traditional stop loss type of product or a fully insured product like what Optum has created. And I'd say the last two things is, look into those products when you're looking at them, understand what that means for you long term from a portability standpoint, because you're not in all cases going to want to stay with the same administrative partner, whether it's one of the Blue Cross affiliates or a Cigna or a United. You want to be able to move your administrative partners as you deem appropriate. Same thing with your stop loss carrier partner. Make sure that it's portable from that perspective as well, so that if you can continue to shop the market effectively, and you have an underlying policy that protects your interests related to these gene therapy, cell therapy concerns, but allows you the flexibility to continue to manage your policies, your administrative relationships as you see fit, so that you're not stuck with one administrator or one stop loss carrier over time, so that you retain your flexibility to make your own decisions and act independently. And then the last part is just price. These are going to come out at various price points. They're going to be all over the board. We have 3 or 4 now, ranging anywhere from $1 per member per month up to $5 or $6 per member per month in some cases. And the definitions matter. And I think Eric mentioned it too in his conversation, which I think is critical. The other part to understand, which I think you're going to start to see a lot more of, is centers of excellence and steerage within these products to facilities who have warranties, outcome-based contracts, capitated arrangements for these treatments for these patients, which is going to require changes to SPD language. It's going to require potentially for members to travel. Ask those questions about what you're purchasing, what the expectation is for your policies, your underlying SPD language, and what the expectations are of you as an employer and from the members in many cases. Is that the true north in all of this should be to always have the member focus, the member outcome to be front and center when you're providing these types of programs and treatment options and to your members and embedding that in your plan. So we're going to see a real evolution of this. It's exciting from an opportunity to treat better, to have better outcomes, but with the magnitude, and you saw it on the one of the first slides, we're expecting this to hit 27, 28 billion in the next couple of years. We are collectively going to have to find a way to best manage this, and putting in the right guardrails now, because as mentioned earlier, you don't know what genetic conditions are within your existing population, much less people you may be hiring over the next few years. And the children that may have some of these deficiencies, putting in these blocks, these protections and guardrails now will serve your interests very well as you move forward. And working with partners who keep their thumb on the pulse of what's happening in this space. What are the options available to self-funded health plan sponsors to mitigate some of this risk as we move forward?
Josh, thanks for that. There was so much gold in what you just said. And, I think even in the last part, you talked about opportunity. And we started this webinar talking about cost and things of what could make employers fearful of managing a health plan. And I think with, Mike and I always talk about this, with the appropriate risk management and the appropriate strategies, it can take fear of something and turn that into an opportunity of setting yourself apart in a positive way, from supply chain management or a risk perspective. I think, just from a summary perspective, Mike, if you don't mind, you mentioned about initially $10 to $11 across the board in cost, and self-funded or fully insured. I thought that was so important to highlight because it shares that just because going fully insured, that doesn't mean that you just put your problem on somebody else. You've put your problem, you put everything on somebody else, and maybe have removed the opportunity from yourself to manage something appropriately and put yourself ahead. And then just tying that to the comparison of organ transplant policies. I know Mike and I both have a lot of clients that have embraced that strategy and kind of the smaller employer or mid-market size of insuring that risk away and paying for it over time. So that's not something you have to worry about when it comes to a stop-loss laser or those sorts of things that could just destroy cash flow. And I think that can put kind of the idea of opportunity back in your mind when you think of it in terms of organ transplant. And just the comparable there. So anyway, there was a lot of gold there, Josh, and thank you for sharing that, and thank you for being here and sticking around for the Q&A component. But I also next up we have Jennifer McCormick, Senior Vice President from the FIA Group. So I think the reason why Mike and I, outside of being huge insurance dorks, have partnered up time and time again is not only do we want to provide sound strategies, but we want to do it in a compliant way. And those two things aren't necessarily a guarantee if you're trying to be innovative, that you're mindful of the rules. But thankfully, Mike and I both are mindful of those rules. And so we're very pleased to have Jennifer McCormick from the FIA Group speak to this from a plan doc perspective and just from a legal compliance perspective. So Jen, thanks for joining us and speaking into the cellular and gene therapy conversation.
Sure, yeah. So that first slide did have a comment from an article that was recent about the moral dilemma that employers are going through. So being self-funded is a very unique position to be in because you do have the opportunity to be creative and have plan language that really matches the intentions of the plan sponsor. And with that does come a huge consideration and huge issues that could weigh heavily on the employer, since they're trying to make these decisions on what the right choice is for their employees and for their families. And that does come at a cost, a moral cost and a financial cost. So I do think that it's important to really have the foundation of what laws and regulations really will lead into making this decision, because it is a choice. it is up to the plan sponsor of a self-funded plan to decide how and the extent to which they do want to offer coverage for this benefit. So over the past 15 or so years, we have seen it's like almost like the potpourri of the different regulations and requirements and the evolution of what we can do, what we must do, what we shouldn't do. So I'll start by sharing some of the foundational laws that we have to keep in mind as we're trying to decide for our self-funded plans. What do we need to do? What are we required to do? So first of all is ACA, the Affordable Care Act. And we know under ACA, there are those 10 categories of the essential health benefits. And with those 10 categories of essential health benefits, we know that a plan is not allowed to put any dollar limitations on place. So when it comes to referring back to the benchmark plans that define what falls within those categories of an essential health benefit, you see things like prescription drugs. And under prescription drugs, we've been talking through this and having our conversation today about how some of these treatments could fall into those different categories. So knowing that to be the case, we know that it'll be really problematic for a plan to have a strict dollar limitation to manage the cost from it by putting it on an essential health benefit. We also know that plans aren't required to cover the essential health benefits, but to the extent that they do, those financial limitations would be in place. And I think it's interesting to share too, recently, that the 2023 final rules about the payment processes for how the essential health benefits are to be categorized, there was a lot of commentary about what it was that a plan would be permitted to do when it comes to defining how they want to outline what they would consider to be essential. And in the regulations that are in effect as of 1/1/2023, they essentially say that it would be problematic for a plan to use cost as a factor for deciding not to cover something. So that's where the clinical piece is really going to be important for making these decisions about what a plan, a self-funded plan in particular, should be covering. Because if the plan is making a decision to exclude something solely based on cost, that's not generally in line with what HHS is requiring or mandating that we do. And even more than that, there was just recently an RFI, a request for information, that went out from HHS asking about, there are so many advancements, there's the evolution of science and technology and how benefits are being managed. So nearly 15 years ago, when those categories of EHBs, essential health benefits, were defined, do we need to revisit that? Do we need to include a broader category? Do we need to examine the ways that people are accessing the costs and how things are costing the different plan sponsors? This is an outstanding question that HHS is asking for public comment on. So I do foresee that this is an issue that is on the radar. This is something that is very important to the agencies, and they're taking it very seriously for the evolution of how things have progressed just over the past 10 or so years. So I imagine that that should be something we keep in mind in deciding what we must do for the compliance piece of it too. The other note here is preventive care under ACA. So should there be a potential screening or strategy that could fall within the category of preventive care we saw with COVID? Now the vaccine is considered a preventive benefit. So it's not impossible that there could be a treatment or something that would need to be required to be covered at 100% for particular plans. Another thing to kind of keep in mind here too is the potential disability or the EEOC considerations. And if you're designing plan language for a particular population, you can't categorize things in a way that could potentially target a particular disability. That'd be concerning. Things need to be neutrally drafted when you're putting plan language in place that would be broadly applicable for a neutral condition or treatment and not a particular individual. Having to keep in mind, there's lots of litigation now that we're starting to see too. And this space 1557 litigation about how certain populations of individuals are being targeted, something that we should keep in mind. We're going through the compliance factors here for this as well. But when it comes time to looking at our plan language, knowing that the clinical piece is going to be important, knowing that there are some potential limitations when it comes to ACA for dollar limitations that we could potentially not impose on our different benefits, knowing there's preventive care requirements, what can we do? What are the things that we are allowed to do? So medical management strategies are still required and still should be used broadly. So what I mean by that is medical necessity is a definition that should be included within every plan. There should be a very strong and tight definition for how medical necessity is defined. when we're talking about these new strategies and the new type of treatments, that should still be a factor in whether or not this would be appropriate for this individual. If we're looking for a treatment and the cap for which that treatment is 2 years old, we're looking at a child who's 2 years and 3 months, maybe it's not medically necessary or in line with the protocols for that particular drug. Another potential strategy could be looking at our experimental investigational definition. Not all of these drugs are FDA approved, and we just went through and discussed the pipeline, which is continuing to grow, but not everything necessarily has approval. So a plan that potentially wants to cover some of these treatments that are not FDA approved, not only is that potentially exposing them to a cost that's unknown, but that's potentially where they're not going to have any sort of reinsurance or other coverage available if they cover something beyond the terms of the plan that could put them in a potential gap situation that Josh had just talked about. But other strategies like prior authorization or pre-certification, those medical management techniques should still be used for all the benefits, not just whether or not a plan decides to cover gene or cell therapy. So it's important that we make sure that we're sort of addressing those pieces too. And the other note here, when we're putting plan language in place and making sure that we're setting ourselves up for success going forward, is considering where we are with our current population. We don't know who we're going to hire in the future, but we do know who we have hired right now. And we do have information about ongoing treatments and benefits. So when we're making a change, it's going to be critical that we're not trying to make changes that could be perceived as being discriminatory because of the timing. So if we know there's a candidate who is looking or undergoing certain treatment on their path or on their journey for a particular gene and cell therapy, to do a change, to modify, to exclude, or limit that benefit mid-year could potentially put the plan at risk of a discrimination issue, whether from the EEOC or otherwise, by targeting that particular individual. So timing is going to matter here. And that's why if we are going to make changes to our plans to either limit the benefits, modify the benefits, or change the benefits, that this is done on a plan year basis, that we're looking forward. So now is the time to do that, to make sure that we're examining what our risk tolerance is going to be and how it is we want to make sure we address these particular conditions. So I'm not sure if there was any other particular questions or things you wanted to cover, but the last note I will share too is keeping in mind GINA too. GINA is not something that we have generally talked about when it comes to compliance issues. But when we're talking and starting to see these new strategies and starting to see the evolution of what can be done for these individuals, we are not allowed in our health insurance decision-making to make decisions based on genetic makeup. So we need to keep that in mind for underwriting purposes and for exclusion purposes, that is not something that we are taking into consideration when we are designing our plan language or how it is that we'll treat these particular conditions. We need to make sure that no matter what we do, from a timing perspective, from a compliance perspective of all the various ACA regulations, EEOC regulations, GINA regulations, ADA disability regulations, that we are doing this in a neutral format.
So it's going to be really easy is what you're saying, Jennifer, right?
Easy, exactly.
So just two follow-up thoughts for you. So number one, we have seen self-funded employers just say we exclude gene therapy. And when there were 1 or 2 or 3 on the market, relatively easy to do. But one of the drugs that's on the horizon in the next 12 months is one that treats sickle cell disease, for example. And sickle cell disease is an affliction that hits a minority population specifically or more often than not. And so all of a sudden, there's more factors that come into play, because if we're excluding all gene therapies, we may almost be perceived as targeting one particular population. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I definitely think that's something that we need to be careful about, and taking the whole picture and the particular employer circumstances into consideration. There's not something specifically that I could point to say, you cannot exclude X drug or Y drug. But all that needs to say is we need to have a broader picture than just looking at that particular drug. Is there an individual that we know about that is undergoing or seeking treatment for that particular drug? What is the risk that this could be putting us from a employee goodwill issue, employer goodwill issue, PR issue? There's a broader set of circumstances that we need to have an analysis and go through our checklist to see if that's the right choice for our risk profile.
Perfect. One final thing that I'll touch on, and then we'll circle back, or we'll bring Ann into the conversation, and then we'll circle back for some Q&A on this. But Josh had talked about different products coming to the marketplace, and Amwins, his company, now has a product that's targeted to covering 3 particular gene therapies. But in order to use that product and take advantage of it, you can't exclude gene therapies from your plan. So now you need to, if you excluded them before, you got to bring them in, and now you got insurance for part of it, but you've actually opened the whole can of worms potentially. And so it's very much a tightrope that one needs to walk.
Exactly. And that certainly can be done easily with plan language that is clear and concise.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jennifer. What we're going to do now is we're going to loop in our final speaker, and then we'll go for some Q&A. So really excited to introduce Ann Jackson, who's a principal and consulting actuary with Milliman. And for those those of you who are unaware of who Milliman is, they are the big dog, preeminent actuarial firm that we work with from a health plan standpoint. And Ann brings some interesting insight into this conversation. When I initially reached out to Milliman, I wanted to get some intake or insight into how insurance plans are starting to prepare for this and price accordingly, and are all the models that insurance companies use to develop their rates changing as a result of this. And Ann had great insight on that, but then she also was able to flip it and say, okay, if you're somebody developing one of these various treatments, what theories or strategies are you using to get insurance companies to cover it? So, and we're really excited you could join us today. And we've got a lot of different questions for you, but specifically, can you talk a little bit about, is gene therapy having an impact on insurance pricing as you can see it? You know, what we'll talk about, if you could, about how life sciences companies are developing different strategies, and Milliman's actually developed a specific tool to address this particular item. So you tell me when you want me to move the slides along, and I'll do it, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, yeah, let's go to the next slide. And I think I just want to frame this up of just sort of talking about risk and sources of risk sort of generally. So just as a reminder, these are the 5 gene therapies that are currently FDA approved, and we've already seen their prices referred to in this panel. And we've already talked about how 3 of these were approved in 2022. All of these treat rare conditions. Skysona treats an incredibly rare condition. I think the comment that I would make when we talk about like what the budget impact is going to be for gene therapies is right now in this snapshot of time, I don't think we have a challenge in funding the expected value, right? So, and we'll talk a little bit about Milliman DNA, but if I just run a 50,000 life group for plan year 2023 and just say it's an average commercial group, average risk, the expected number of cases for any of across these 5 gene therapies is 0.1. And the expected cost is $280,000, right? That's not a challenge to fund necessarily for a 50,000 life group. Where I think the risk is there's no such thing as a $280,000 case. Like you will not incur that, right? None of these have a price tag that low, right? It's impossible to have 0.1 of a case. And if we go to the next slide, when we start thinking through simulations, like even though we have this expected value, only 3% of our simulations actually result in a whole case, right? That's our challenge, is to say, like, we can't anticipate when we're going to have exposure to, and this is just on those 5, right? And we've talked about the really rich pipeline. So we can't anticipate when we're going to have that claim incurred, right? We talk a lot about being able to look at experience and look through our claims history. This is a really immature space, right? For gene therapy, we don't have the luxury. And when we're talking about rare diseases, if you've had a case, does that make you think, all right, you know, I've had my exposure now. That was my 3% bad year kind of thing. Like, what is that right mindset for saying, how do we mitigate against a shock event, right? Even if we look over 3 years for these 5 therapies, there's a 94% probability that we have no cases. It doesn't mean not to prepare, but we need to think through how do you efficiently sort of address that risk. And if we go to the next slide, it's so much more complicated because we do have a dynamic pipeline. So we've got an immature market that's constantly adding new therapies. And what we may not necessarily understand is Should we believe that if we can get a large enough pooled population, that we can be confident in the expected pattern of demand, right? When we look at all of the conditions that are being studied, they present very differently. They have different sets of unmet need. They have different sort of emergent or urgent qualities to them. And so this pattern of demand, even if we said, well, we're really comfortable with how Zolgensma presents in a population, that's not necessarily the same way that we're going to see a beta thalassemia or a hemophilia therapy and pattern of demand emerge. Right. So as we get more of these therapies approved, do we actually think that's going to help us reduce our volatility, or will we be constantly adding new uncertainty in the market? And I think, Josh said the prices for risk mitigation products that are out in the marketplace are all over the place right now. So I think as you think through what's that right, efficient risk mitigation strategy, it also needs to be dynamic. Right? Can you reshop and revisit? And how is it that you understand how to compare these very different price points and potentially different scope of coverages from one to another, right? Even as the carriers in the marketplace are maturing and learning and bringing their own risk mitigation techniques, there's certainly an awful lot of room here for someone to be innovative. So one comment that I'll make if we go to the next slide is, oh, one more. Can we just go one more slide? Yeah. So early on, Mike said it, we do a lot of work in the life sciences space here out of this Milliman practice. And as we were looking through this pipeline, it just became obvious that it was going to be unsustainable for health plans and payers, and certainly for employers, to stay well informed, right? And in fact, it was going to be really inefficient, right? So as we started talking to primary and secondary payers, like we were realizing they're spending an awful lot of energy researching the next therapy that could be FDA approved. And there's so many therapies now in the pipeline, and many of them won't get FDA approved, that it would be very difficult for a health plan, even with all of their resources, to understand the best way to apply those scarce resources to this research. So what we ended up doing is saying we should really sort of consolidate and centralize that effort. And what we ended up creating is this Milliman DNA product, which says, gosh, if we could get some of the foundational pieces of information in a centralized place, does that allow primary and secondary payers now to sort of have almost a sandbox to start with, to say, what is the magnitude of this risk? What is the extent of the volatility that's associated with the gene and cell therapy pipeline? So that there would be a place to begin to say, where can we innovate, right? Which are these pieces of risk that we would actually be able to manage and mitigate? And so what we ended up doing is putting this together. It has two components to it. We can go to the next slide. That it has these sort of two pieces to it. Is one of them is a research repository that says most of these conditions we haven't heard of, right? We don't know what part of the population they present in. We don't understand what other treatments may or may not be available for these therapies or for these conditions. Let's get all of that information in one place. And then also create some visibility into this discrepancy between an indicated population and a population that's eligible to be treated, right? So one of the sort of the areas I think that can be misunderstood is, for example, we hear, oh, there's going to be a gene therapy for hemophilia. And we think, oh my goodness, there's so many people with hemophilia. It's still a rare condition, but we've heard of it. We know about it. And one of the elements that we wanted to bring in with this research repository is this concept of a patient funnel, right? So if you were just to Google how many people have hemophilia B, you'd get this sort of top line number of, say, 5,600 people in the United States have hemophilia B. And then if we start running the numbers and saying, oh, $3.5 million treatment, boy, that's a huge hit. Instead, what we wanted to shine light on is to say, all right, well, there's age requirements, there's severity requirements, there's some liver function requirements. You can't have the exposure to the virus vector, and begin to sort of whittle that population down, stratified across commercial and Medicaid, Medicare for other conditions, and then say, this is the number of people who may be treatment eligible. And then prompt the user to contemplate what's the rate at which people will seek treatment, right? And this can be very different from condition to condition, right? Are there any other standard of care that are acceptable, right, or not? And that can really affect the rate at which we see patients sort of seeking to be treated, right? And all of those things taken together then feed this dynamic online interface, where what we really wanted to encourage payers to do is to say, go ahead and drill into like the pipeline of not yet approved. Where is the next biggest potential likelihood of approvals and cases coming from? To begin to think, should there be a center of excellence? How is it that you can manage exposure to these particular cases? Are there some underwriting reforms that you might want to implement, right? Sort of get to the point of saying, if we were going to enable access and coverage for cell and gene therapies, are there any feasible ways, and again, like I would say, efficient and financially viable ways to address the risk that's inherent in a really uncertain pipeline? So having said all that, there's one other component of risk that I think that we would want to talk about if we go to the next slide. And my teeth, oh, sorry, these are the outputs to it, again, saying that it's very dynamic. So we also have on the other side of this, the fact that the developers of these therapies are really keenly interested in assuring access to their therapies. And early on, there was a whole host of financing strategies that were being discussed. And we've got two slides of these, right, of really sort of financially engineered solutions that could be brought to the market. What's happened, I think, over time is that many of these require coordination between payers, right? If we're going to set up a risk pool, the payers in the state of Massachusetts said that they were going to sort of create this for themselves, right? That they were going to enter into agreements with one another to be able to create their own risk pool, right? That a lot of these solutions require either coordination or actual legislation in order to be viable. And for a manufacturer who is sitting there at the end of their phase 3 clinical trial and hasn't made any money off of this investment yet, they may not have the time to wait for this sort of multilateral, elegant solution to enter in the marketplace that would create sort of access for all. So what we've seen instead is a much greater focus on agreements that can be bilaterally implemented, right? So that the manufacturer can work with a payer to say, these are the terms under which we'll grant access. And even that is really complicated for all the reasons that we know, right? And anytime you've got a patient and a provider and a payer and money involved, particularly when we start talking about agreements that are multi-years long, the number of challenges that arise are really significant. But we're finding that these manufacturers are willing to put a claim out there to say, we've priced this drug for success. And if it turns out it isn't durable, we will share in some of that. We've also seen cases, though, where the manufacturer says, this is an incredibly small population, and we're not going to go at risk for it, right? There's no other treatment for this condition. We think it should just be covered because it is the first treatment for the condition, and the price is the price. And they're sort of saying, we're just going to keep this simple, right? If you're going to have 35 patients a year to be dosed with something, at some point you may just say, maybe we can't contract for every potential case. So that's the other side of it on the risk mitigation, is to say, is price equivalent to value? And we're seeing manufacturers be very interested in entering into those kinds of agreements. I think they're going to be difficult to scale, and sort of difficult to measure, particularly the ones that have the softer endpoints, right? Eric talked about the Zolgensma endpoints, for example. I think if we're talking about transfusion-dependent beta thalassemia, got a really good endpoint. Are you no longer transfusion dependent? For hemophilia, we've got really good endpoints. Are you no longer factor or novel non-factor dependent? But once you sort of get outside of those clinical endpoints, these can be really difficult to adjudicate. So I'll leave it at that, the thoughts on sources of risk and who's trying to mitigate them.
And I thank you. That was incredibly scary and insightful all at the same time. And I'd like to invite our other panelists back to the Brady Bunch segment of our conversation too. So for our folks in the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll get to as many as we can. I know that both Ben and I have some, and then if we again hit an endpoint, we'll wrap this up. And a question for you before I turn it over to Ben to ask another one is one of the challenges when developing the price tag for the hemophilia, for example, the manufacturer of this new treatment knows what it costs to treat a hemophiliac over the period of a lifespan, for example. And they're saying, let's say it costs $5 million. So if we're coming in at 3.5, it's a deal. But from an employer's perspective, that's a $3.5 million hit right now versus being spread out all the entire time. And you might write a check for that, and then the employee picks up and goes work somewhere else. So can you talk about how the life sciences industry is understanding that could be a challenge for employers or insurers?
Yeah, they definitely know it's a challenge, right? I mean, this is a real pain point. I think there's also while the person is actively being treated for hemophilia, they may be less likely to leave their employer, right? We've done some retention studies for either employees or their dependents who have rare diseases, and they definitely have a longer retention period, likely because they need their medical benefits, they're used to the network, things like this. There's a big question that if a person felt that they had been successfully treated for hemophilia, do they now actually, you could argue that they become more loyal to their employer who enabled them to have access to this. You could also argue now that they've sort of been untethered from the need to have this medical network. It is a real concern. And I think this is another example where we can study on historic patterns, but when these conversations start to happen between a manufacturer and a payer, they can get just sort of really emotional, right? It's a belief, right? It isn't evidence. And that's a real challenge. We've heard of manufacturers who have wanted to say, what is that right way to share that risk of the patient leaving? I think you can get to sort of an absurd place too, right? That the person might leave to another payer, and you might think of something really complicated, this reciprocity agreement, for example, or the contract should follow the patient in some way. But what if the patient were to die? What if the patient were to become incarcerated? Like, how many of these different cases would we actually even solve for? I think right now the prevailing expectation is that there would be a contract in place that would allow, say, a refund back to that primary payer if an endpoint isn't met, right? So if the patient fails to show up or they fail to report that endpoint, you haven't proven failure. And I think that sort of de facto puts the risk back on the original payer. So it's something that still could be solved for, but that one's a really tough one.
Yeah, I really appreciate that insight. And I was thinking about this question, and I'm going to sling it out there anyway. I'm kind of a challenger at heart, but it's along those lines, Anne. And you talked about endpoints, positive endpoints, and I really like that perspective, because I think the thing that I struggle with at times, and I imagine other employers on this call struggle with at times, is what we talked about in Jennifer's segment about the moral dilemma in this. And quite honestly, I kind of feel like the moral dilemma has only shown up in one place, and that's with the insurance company or the employer. They're the ones with the moral dilemma, but I think there's moral dilemma with everyone involved, right? Of if you spend a lot of money on research to develop a medication and it's not a therapy that maybe the market doesn't determine as valuable because the endpoint isn't positive, or maybe the morality dilemma is how much you charge for that. So, and I think everyone has a stake in the game of questioning other parties involved, of everyone's moral input to this. So how would you, and it's along the lines, I think, Anne, of what you mentioned, but how would you encourage an employer to dig into that conversation so they don't feel like they're the recipient of all the moral questions when other parties can be brought into that as well?
So yeah, that's a lot. So one comment that I would make is I think that the decision shouldn't be, do we cover gene therapy or do we don't cover gene therapy? Because I think when we look across even the approved drugs and when we look across the pipeline, that really simple decision doesn't do justice to the significant unmet need. And I think the challenge with some of these treatments is the decision has to be made really quickly, right? So we hear with Zolgensma, like time is neurons, right? Like days matter. And I think, unfortunately, we've just said, like, the expected number of cases for like a relatively smaller employer group is effectively none this year and probably none next year. And so how is it that we encourage an employer to say, can you go through the thought exercise, right? And imagine a case is presented to you. What's the decision and why? And like, again, I understand strained resources and scarce resources. And it's like, how do you prioritize some of those thought exercises for the what if, right? And for that sort of contingency planning, and then to make sure you have all of your mitigation partners in place. I think that's difficult, right? To ask an employer to set that time aside. But it just feels a little oversimplistic to say, well, the easy answer is to say we're not going to cover gene therapy. And over the next couple of years, it's only going to get sort of more difficult to contemplate. We're going to start seeing a competitive gene therapy space, right? So right now, it's sort of you're just a price taker, right? That there's either you are going to allow someone to have access to the one and only one therapy, but we're going to enter into a competitive space. So I think sort of building up our sophistication and the way that we think about coverage for these treatments is really important.
Thank you, Anne. I've got a couple other questions, and Ben does too for other panelists. So Josh, coming to you, you touched on this briefly, but I want to make sure I clarify the point. So Optum's developed a product that has some limitations. It's good in some areas and bad in others. And the only way you can get it right now is to work with Optum. Cigna's developed a similar product. Amwins has developed a similar but different product. And so what employers are going to have to do, it sounds like now, is rather than being able to throw the spaghetti at the wall and buy stop loss as stop loss, if this is important to you, you might be limiting the choices that you have in order to get one of the products that might be more appealing. Is that true?
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the products are going to be tied to the underlying third-party administrator for the medical network and the adjudication of the claims. And that's because they want to have more control over the claims process, the prior authorization, all of which, to some degree makes some sense. And obviously the more bundled than the product, the more revenue they can drive. So it makes it very sticky from that respect. Similar with Optum's product, again, another thing that's a bit of a limitation is they filed it in 35 states where they've received approval, and a filed product, and we've all hit on this, is how dynamic this space is, how quickly it's changing. Every time you want to add a drug or change the price, you have to go back and refile the product, which takes time, 6 months to 9 months or a year, in some cases, or longer for certain states. So again, just understanding the product, how it's being administered, what are the tie-ins to that product, how nimble is that product to be able to move, how quickly can it move to address new unexpected approvals, like Adstiladrin, which came out. Nobody thought that was coming. That wasn't really even on the radar at the time, but it got approved. And there's going to be more of those types of scenarios. So understanding the portability of the product, how flexible it can and how nimble it is and how quickly it can move, and obviously the price point, which we've talked about. Does the coverage and protection the pre-existing condition exclusions, all of these have those in it to mitigate risk selection and bias and other issues. Understand those and try to match up the product that best fits your desired coverage terms and your risk tolerance and your culture of your organization. Because there's four out in the market today. Another one is out there with Excess Re that I've seen. But to Ann's point around competition, as far as like with different treatments, there's going to be 2 for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. We'll probably wake up 6 months from now and have 8 to 10 of these types of products out in the marketplace, and they're all going to be created differently. So getting into the weeds, rolling up your sleeves, understanding it, and matching it up with how you want to finance and protect your plan is critical.
Perfect. I've got Ben. Do you have a question?
I actually don't at this point.
All right, I've got 2, one for Eric and one for Jennifer. So Jennifer, you talked about making sure employers are reviewing their plan document. In the olden days, we'd build a high quality plan document for a self-funded plan and put it on the shelf, and it kind of sat there and did its thing. Now what it sounds like is this might be something that you have to look at more than once a year. And you're with the FIA Group, one of the preeminent consulting companies for employee benefit plans. Do you anticipate FIA is going to come up with kind of a best practice tool that employers can bounce their plan document against to make sure that we're not missing anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think this is going to be a changing environment. We've seen this now with just the regulations with COVID and the No Surprises Act, that we're having to make changes to plan documents more frequently than we had in the past. And in this space, I think this is going to continue to be the strategy that plans are going to have to employ to stay on top of what's changing and what they need to do to address it proactively. And we can certainly help with that.
Perfect. And just disclaimer, everything you share with us today was informational, but not legal advice. But if we wanted
thank
to
you.
for your opinion, we could, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Perfect. Eric, last question for you, and then I'll turn it over to Ben to wrap us up today. So Eric, one of the strategies that we glanced over is seeing potentially that the pharmacy benefit manager, because they have a larger population they manage, they could be working with these various manufacturers to negotiate better deals. Mm-hmm. You referenced that the PBMs in general won't play a huge role in this, but do you see that's one role that TrueRx or other PBMs may play?
I think certainly the contracting role, unfortunately the naughty word, which if we start talking about it, we'll be here for 3 more days, is rebates. What will the rebates look like around those? Because we use those to help at least offset some of the cost along the way. So I think absolutely the PBM contracting is going to be important. And that's where, partnering with a TPA that's willing to let us into that. It's very similar, right? Medications that are billed under the HCPCS codes, whether it's J code, Q code, C code, R code, any of those, a good PBM TPA relationship can really drop those costs dramatically at 0 patient disruption. And I think you're right, Mike, the contracting oomph we all bring together. And frankly, this is an opportunity for all PBMs to kind of throw in together and make sure that this is affordable, because bottom line, these are patients, these are human beings who've gotten, in the case of Zolgensma, some devastating news. And then to be told, oh, by the way, it's okay, there's a treatment and it might work and it certainly will help. Oh yeah, it's $2.3 million. I mean, my goodness, why don't we just kick people while they're down and then roll them over and kick them again? So definitely negotiation and contracting is a key role for PBMs.
Eric, I got a question for you along that regard. We found a lot of success by working with transparent PBMs, and in particularly with you all at TrueRx, and how that type of changing a vendor relationship into a partner relationship has grown immense value for our clients, now going on 5+ years. And I'm sure it's been that way even longer. But do you believe this type of environment with gene and cellular therapies, as well as just advanced medicine, do you see that forcing maybe more status quo PBMs to change their practice? Or do you think that will just grow the chasm even wider?
I think the chasm will be wider, bluntly, because they're not prepared to deal with this if they don't have a clinical team up and ready to go already. They're going to be so far behind the curve, ramping up 20, 30 clinical pharmacists has taken us years to get there. And, even within that, we have specialists. There's a pharmacist who just does rebates. There's one who just does diabetes. There's one who just does this. I just don't see the large PBMs being able to pivot quickly enough. They will eventually, they'll have to. But, we talk a lot about rare diseases and these things, but, one of the areas that gene therapy is looking at really hard right now is Parkinson's disease. That is not an orphan condition. And the number of people with Parkinson's is only going to increase as our population continues to age. So it isn't going to be such a unique situation anymore. And, you are going to need that partner relationship versus just a vendor relationship to come in and say, yeah, just do this. I mean, the reality is when we're having conversations with clients, probably all of us on this call are going to be in a room, and then we're going to have another half dozen people there too. As long as Jennifer says it's all okay at the end.
Very good. Well, unless we have any other questions that roll through Q&A, just wanted to thank you all for giving your professional insight into this really complex conversation. Quite honestly, I think this being present is ahead of the game. And I want to particularly thank Mike Hill for setting this conversation up because this is something that's going to be wildly important to begin thinking about and talking about strategy now with the right partners in the room. So I wanted to thank you all for being a part of this conversation. And again, Mike Hill, thank you so much for putting this together. And wanted to congratulate everyone that participated on the webinar from an insightful perspective. Again, talked about it being like a 500 level course, potentially a doctorate. We certainly got into the weeds and saw and got a wonderful education about the problem and then possible solutions. So congrats to everyone who took the time to be with us today. So until next time, thank you, everybody, and we'll talk soon.